Hi folks! I hope you're all excited to be delving into standardized education this week. As I talked about in the What is this course all about video, Engaging Minds really focuses on modern schooling arising in around the 1600s, 1700s. However, this doesn't mean that schooling and learning didn't exist prior to the Age of Enlightenment. We're going to talk more about that here and the birth of modern schooling. But before we go into that history, I want to talk a little bit about epistemologies. So what is epistemology? Epistemology, which comes from the Greek episteme, is a branch of philosophy that's concerned with questions of knowledge, including how it's generated and how it's learned. And within research, it influences and supports our methodology, as well as justifying and evaluating the meaning or knowledge that we garner from our results. So here we have a visual representation of some different epistemologies and how they're all connected. And this comes from another book by Davis called Inventions of Teaching. And I can't remember if he has a formal name for this tree, but I generally just call it the epistemology tree. So today we're just going to be looking at the metaphysical branch. So in short, epistemologies on the metaphysical branch believe that there's some sort of truth out there that we can discover. And a lot of the discussion here is framed by the ancient distinction between spiritual knowledge, or gnosis, and practical how-to, or episteme. And these are terms that both popped up in our readings this week. These words appear in our readings when Davis is talking about how a lot of European languages have different terms to distinguish different types of knowing or knowledge. So of course in the Greek we have gnosis and episteme. In French we have connaissance and savoir. They both mean knowledge in English, but they are pretty distinct terms, which can be a little difficult for a lot of us Anglophones to initially pick up on. So connaissance can indicate a familiarity or even an intimacy, and savoir, on the other hand, is used when we're talking about awareness of facts or details. So the first category, which I'm just going to call gnosis, knowledge for sake of brevity, is more spiritual, ethical way of knowing that's concerned with complexities and the mysteries of our existence. So in short, it's spiritual knowledge. And we see this more in arts manifested as fables, fairy tales, myths, poetry. We could even understand art, music, and dance this way. A lot of times people in our more episteme-focused mindset will immediately want to say, ask an artist what their intention was. What were they trying to say in their art? But as Davis says in Inventions of Teachings, art is not a literal expression, but an effort to point beyond itself to prompt attentions to possibilities that exceed us at the moment and to events that surpass rational explanation. And C.S. Lewis also has a great quote in The Great Divorce that I think nicely highlights this, where he describes how a painter catches glimpses of heaven in earthly landscape, and in painting it they allow others to see it as well. So off of the gnosis branch we have mysticism and religion. Mysticism refers to a broad range of perspectives clustered around the belief in a reality that exceeds normal human experience and perceptual capacities. And here teaching is more about drawing out what was already there, what was woven into one's being from the beginning. And religion differs from this because mysticism is more about introspection, and religion can be understood more as a body of knowledge being imposed from outside or above. And here teaching can be understood as drawing in. This idea of teaching being about imparting knowledge onto learners has roots in religion. Here the learner is an empty vessel waiting to be filled with knowledge. So what does this mean in terms of history? Humans are a teaching species, and we pass down knowledge to the next generation. And this dates back prior to any written historical account. So for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to talk about formal education that has a bit more of a record. So when I talk about formal education, I mean social institutions that were designed to gather and disseminate insights through enrolling and teaching a body of students. And the presence of these formal schools tends to occur around the time that a culture develops some sort of writing, partially because writing takes a lot of time and instruction to learn, but also because you need more people who are educated and literate to be able to record information. And we can see evidence of formal schooling across cultures, with the first thought to have originated in ancient Egypt with the education of scribes. In the ancient world, schooling was reserved for the elites, so those from privileged backgrounds and principally males. And this formal schooling tended to focus more on literacy and math. At this time, schooling was far more spiritual, and ancient schooling generally focused more on gnosis knowledge. And this more wisdom-oriented view of knowledge prevailed through most of the history of formal education. Although episteme knowledge was acknowledged, it was seen as complementary to gnosis knowledge, and both were seen as serving their own purpose. And we start to see more of an emphasis on this religious branch in the Western world in the Middle Ages, when formal education was almost entirely delivered by the church. Once again, those schooled were mostly boys. And at this time, the real purpose of these schools was to train boys who may become clergy members. So order, ranking, and sorting of students were all major tasks in accomplishing this. And the curriculum was mostly religious, although they did include things like math, astronomy, music, and writing. And this ended up being the first real model for mass education in Europe, and it was pretty influential in modern schooling. Even some of the language we used is influenced by this. For example, doctor, which is the highest degree awarded, is related to doctrine or indoctrinate, and professor comes from the idea of professing one's faith. So here we can see how teaching is more about pulling in. It's about indoctrinating flawed, incomplete learners, so still looking more at that gnosis knowledge. But we really start to see a big shift in the 1600s during the Enlightenment in Europe. Previously, there was a relative balance between gnosis and episteme, if not maybe a bit more in favor of gnosis, and it really swings in favor of episteme at this time. Now, episteme is really more about facts, skills, truths, the pragmatic needs of life, or the practical know-how, if you will. So it's pretty linear, and it looks at things in kind of a cause-effect lens. And off of this branch, we have rationalism and empiricism. So rationalism is most often associated with René Descartes, who rejected scholasticism as the uncritical mix of episteme and gnosis, and argued that the two really needed to be separated. The road to the truth, Descartes thought, was through logical deduction or a priori reasoning. And here teaching can be understood as instructing. Empiricism is mostly associated with Francis Bacon. And empiricism is also looking for truths, but unlike rationalism, so it's strongly associated with analytical sciences and has an emphasis on experimentation and demonstration, looking for patterns amid repeated testing. And here teaching can be understood more as training. Now, you might be wondering why gnosis and episteme are on the same metaphysical branch since they seem so different. We're talking religion and science here. And while they may seem very, very different, what they have in common is that they're all rooted in this idea that truth is an ideal form. It's something that's out there beyond the physical. And there is this ideal realm out there that we can access through a lot of discipline and mental effort, whether this be spiritual discipline or logical deduction from the sciences. Now, a big reason why we see this shift from gnosis knowledge to episteme knowledge is because, well, there was a lot going on during the Age of Enlightenment. There were a lot of cultural and societal changes that were going on. For example, there was increased emphasis on reason and individualism rather than religion and tradition. Through print media, we now had mass communication, the rise of capitalism, the scientific revolution, European colonialism, the ramifications of which we will be discussing in democratic citizenship education, and the Industrial Revolution. And this, of course, means factories and urbanization. So the Industrial Revolution drew people out of rural areas into the cities. And Davis talks about how this fractured the extended family, and people needed a place for their kids while they worked. This, combined with the need for a workforce that could read and do math, led to the birth of modern schooling. However, it is important to note here that not all kids were in school. What Engaging Minds kind of glosses over is that a lot of children from poor families worked in these factories. In fact, the Industrial Revolution actually created even more demand for child labor than ever before. In 1815 in England, the Act for the Preservation of the Health and Morals of Apprentices and Other Employed in Cotton and Other Mills, which was initially providing some provisions for basic education for apprentices at cotton mills, but not the children working there, was amended to include other types of mills where you could find children employed. This amendment prohibited children under the age of 10 from working, and it said that the children who were working in these mills needed to be provided with at least a half hour of instruction in reading, writing, and arithmetic each working day for the first 4 years that they worked at the mill. And school was not compulsory for children in England until the 1880s. And the first modern schools were pretty influenced by earlier instances of formal schooling, such as the religious schools. However, the structure was very akin to a factory, with efficient assembly lines, standardized outputs, a capacity for mass production, and quality controls like tests. So this was a clear shift from gnosis to episteme. So at this point, schools were no longer about accessing deeper truths and readiness for life. Rather, it was about preparing students, future workers, for the job market. And this can be described as education for social efficiency in vocational education, which prepares learners for the job market within the current social system, benefiting businesses and seemingly preparing them for the work world. However, as we'll discuss in authentic education and in democratic citizenship education, this model can be oppressive and it perpetuates social order. And that's all for now, folks. I hope you enjoyed this brief introduction to epistemologies and the rise of modern schooling. And in my next video, we'll talk about some practical implications for standardized education. Please feel free to ask questions, leave me comments, And as always, I will see you all online.